did she just announce that to everybody? Like I had a very loud voice just speak to me. And I wanted to say welcome to Kevin Mullen and also to Susan Kennedy, who works with Kevin. Kevin, it's nice to see you again. I recall fondly our time together, I think in 2015, but I can't, maybe it was actually earlier than that when you came and you were doing coffee with clergy in your constituency, and I was one of those clergy, and we had coffee, and it was a great outreach. So I'm really happy to see you again.
It's great to be with you, Matthew, and you were definitely a standout in that discussion in the coffee with clergy, and we're sad to lose you from Assembly District 22 in San Mateo County, but it's also good to know that you're up in my other neck of the woods near the state capitol, where I spend almost 7 months a year representing San Mateo County in that beautiful white building, the state capitol. But great to see you've landed in a wonderful spot, sir.
Thank you, and it's lovely to be here. I think what you mean by being a standout is that I couldn't shut up.
I didn't want to phrase it quite like that. It was great to have you in that session. Okay. You kept the conversation going, which is half the battle in those things sometimes.
Yeah. And then when did you become let me get this right, the Speaker Pro Tem of the Assembly?
Well, I should really know that answer off the top of my head. I think it was probably shortly after our 2015 conversation, I formally became the Speaker Pro Tem, not the Speaker. The Speaker is the number one person. I've served under a couple of different speakers now. First, Toni Atkins, who has gone on to be a senator, and now she's the leader of the state Senate. She represents San Diego. I served under her when she was the Speaker, and then Anthony Rendon, the second Speaker I served under. He's still our Speaker. He's in my same class of 2012 in the State Assembly. So we're all going to be termed, the class of 2012 will be termed out in 2024. So we're kind of entering the home stretch of our service in Sacramento, but it's a wonderful role for me. I get to represent Northern California, really, on the leadership team. And I get to preside over our sessions, but I don't have to deal with some of the messy political stuff that the Speaker has to deal with. So I love being the number two guy. Let's put it that way. It's a lot easier being the number two than the number one.
Do you all have to like brush up on all of the procedure and stuff to manage that?
Yeah, it's very much an operational role. You make parliamentary rulings, which happen every now and again. Mostly it's sort of like being the teacher of the class in a way. You're sort of monitoring the debate, calling on members to speak, and yes, making rulings as needed. But most importantly, and maybe relevant for our conversation today, is it's maintaining decorum and civility among the members. Occasionally we have some heated debates, but we want to keep the heat level manageable, and we want to be respectful of one another and keep to the procedures and the traditions of the House, so we can have a vigorous debate, yet do it in a way that's respectful of one another. And that's a crucial role of the Speaker Pro Tem. And so the use of language is very relevant in that role. And occasionally language will be used that sort of crosses a line, and there will be some parliamentary sort of responses to that. But part of my role is to kind of treat both parties with respect and sort of act as almost like a referee in a way. And I'm a Democrat, so I'm not completely impartial, but the reality is in that role, I have to show an even-handed approach and encourage civil debate, so we can be something of a model in that regard in terms of respect and cooperation among the parties, even with some really strong, policy disagreements.
Yes, Kevin, that was an extraordinarily elegant segue. Me saying elegant segue was not elegant, but that takes us into our theme, really. Back in the election last year, we had a Braver Angels program. I don't know if you're aware of Braver Angels. It's a ministry that encourages people to try and maintain civil debate across differences of politics. And we were praying for civility and trying to do some work on the idea of civility in public life. And that gave birth to this idea of the Dean's Forum, when I recognized that actually the way that we use language with each other can be charged and conflictual in all sorts of ways. And we can dehumanize each other, and we can rule and invalidate each other's opinions. So we've had 2 Dean's Forums now in this format. One was from a theologian and a preacher from England. He joined us via Zoom from Cambridge and talked about the language of poetry. Another was a local leader, and she's a poet herself and also writes on poetry. And she talked about literalism and the Bible and the idea of metaphors in the Bible. So we're going in a very different direction now, but I'm really grateful for you being here and being willing to do that, and just talking about the idea of polarizing language and politics, and whether we've kind of lost our way in a way, and can we get back to something more civil in public discourse? So that's what we're talking about, and I wondered if you wanted to reflect on that for a little bit before I asked some specific questions.
Sure. I do have a little bit of a brief presentation, Matthew, a little bit of a preamble here, but I want to obviously leave lots of time for questions. I want to hear from folks, and the use of words has definitely become more challenging in our day-to-day lives, definitely in politics. I believe that we are in the midst of a social media, and there's no big revelation here, but I think we're in the midst of a social media and technological revolution. And we're quite literally in the midst of trying to make sense of all of this technology. It's influencing social movements, and it's really affecting democracy itself. So it's a little bit of a tangent to the specific issue around the use of language, but that's the context that we're operating in the political world and in society at large. So as a political figure, as a public figure, I'm ever mindful that a poorly chosen word can be captured and reverberate over social media, perhaps be amplified, maybe blown out of proportion, or maybe there's not enough context being given as to why somebody said what they did. But the platforms that we are using are incredibly powerful tools that are giving voice to previously marginalized communities, and can have a balancing of the power playing field aspect to them as well, and provide a forum for communication. Like this morning's gathering, we're using technology to gather. I'm in South City, South San Francisco, you're in Sacramento. But people can have their voices heard at a local city council meeting, for example, have their opinions heard using this kind of technology if they're not able to easily attend meetings in person. So effective conversations require us to actively participate both as a listener and as a speaker. In politics, we hear a lot of rhetoric that can be and often is negative in an effort to excite or incite a particular base to try to affect an outcome. As our politics has become more tribal, there has been a rise in extremism. And the most heated rhetoric or the most incendiary language will get the most attention on these platforms. It's not really conducive to sort of calm conversation. It's sort of the most heated rhetoric will get the clicks, we'll get eyeballs, we'll get retweeted, we'll get sent out. And that is, you see a lot of what we call in politics playing to the base, sort of playing to the folks that already more or less agree with you, but getting them energized. That can affect both campaigns and the way policy gets developed. So I'm sure playing to the base has always been a reality in politics in time immemorial, but it's being given more currency, I think, in today's very divisive politics that we're living through. So I took a executive education way back in another life. I took an executive education course at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, and David Gergen was one of our are professors, and he's a presidential advisor to both Democrats and Republicans. He's a bipartisan kind of a guy. And he talked about the three-legged stool in which we operate in politics. It's the development of sound policy, governing. We have to make decisions around certain policies, but the ability to navigate the politics around a situation, and then effective communication. You have to be able to communicate to the public and get the public's support for your idea. So you actually have to accomplish all three of those to be effective at governing as a whole. So the rhetoric of politics has created significant challenges when attempting to create policy. So messaging, the use of language to influence and persuade has become increasingly important. Effective messaging can present challenges because often our terminology can get in the way. As a result, people may think that they oppose certain policies because the message doesn't really resonate with them. So the use of language is crucial. We are ever mindful that people are being bombarded with images and information pretty much all the time, all through their TVs, through their mobile phones, and I've got mine sitting right in front of me here. At the gym or the airport, you see screens, information sort of washing over everybody. So there's a need to sort of cut through with a bold and very clear kind of a message so people can understand what you're trying to do. But this is not always easy with very complicated topics. Let's face it, these things are nuanced topics. There are very few sort of black and white issues, at least in the world I live in. Many issues are sort of 60-40 or 55-45 kinds of issues when you're making a decision about a bill, for example. But just to give you one minor example, I'm working on a bill that will make regional climate change adaptation planning easier to accomplish. Now that's a mouthful just in and of itself, right? But the bill moved to the Senate this week, got strong bipartisan support. But messaging for this bill has been important because if I only focus on the technical terminology around regional climate adaptation planning and resiliency, that's a word I use all the time, resiliency, lots of people would not necessarily see how that might impact them directly. But when I make sure to point out that this issue is important because it will help address wildfire prevention, for example. We're in a drought, and wildfire is a threat really to most areas of California, and that's actually going to get worse. If you talk about flooding and clean drinking water, that a particular mobile home park, for example, in the bay level rise inundation zone, or more simply put, the flood zone, when sea level rise hits, people may have a better understanding of how important the sea level rise issue is to everyone, and maybe not just to a small group, but a larger geographic area. And public support may be easier to achieve if people sort of get the stakes. So the use of language is really important. And I myself get stuck in kind of government speak and policy speak, and I'm not enough of a storyteller. People, I think, process information through storytelling and understanding a particular person's plight. And I'd love to get Matthew's thoughts on this, because as somebody who is often in a public speaking role himself, how you resonate with your congregants and how you tell stories that actually connect with people. So you're not just kind of speaking in generality. So I'm sure I could learn something from you, but this is a great example of a mutual conversation when people can recognize their shared interest in an issue. From time to time, we should all take a moment to think about how we use our words. Do we listen actively, or are we constantly thinking about what we're going to say next? Focusing on how we can find common ground to make sure we do the most good for the most people will make a big difference in politics and in our day-to-day lives. And I just wanted to make a quick reference. This is actually a little bit of a historical reference, but George Lakoff is a linguistics professor at UC Berkeley, and he rose to prominence in the mid-2000s. He wrote a book called Don't Think of an Elephant, about the use of language in politics. And full disclosure, he's done some work for the Democratic Party. And I know our discussion this morning is absolutely nonpartisan, but some have criticized his work as a little bit simplistic. But I think it is instructive. He talks about how people think in frames and how crucial it is to frame the debate from the outset, essentially setting the rules for what is to come in the discussion with regard to the words that get employed to make one's case to the public about the value of your position. So my party has gotten into the habit of talking about policies and programs, and I still do to this day, instead of people and values and what it means, what these policies actually mean in people's lives. So our current president, Joe Biden, has taken some of those historical language lessons and applied them to the American Rescue Plan, or the American Families Plan, or most recently the American Jobs Plan. So not the infrastructure plan, although we still use that word a lot in politics, because what does infrastructure really mean? Well, it means roads and bridges and broadband and human infrastructure. That's another discussion, but he's condensed these things into short, 3-word plans that are digestible, easy to swallow for lots of people who are needing rescue in this horrible pandemic that we're living through, or who are in desperate need of a job as the economy gradually recovers. So that's just a little current day example, a real world example of simple, clear, direct use of language that might resonate better than some long title or some deep explanation. So whether or not those chosen words will result in the plan's success, that's a question for another day, and a question for Washington, D.C., not Sacramento. But those of us, so those are a few thoughts at the outset, and I look forward to hearing what's on the mind of the folks on the call today on this beautiful Sunday morning. And again, it's my sincere pleasure to be with all of you and to hear some words from all of you. So Matthew, I hope that just primed the pump a little bit for a discussion about sort of the political culture we're in and the use of language and how we can treat each other better in our politics. And that's something that I've been thinking a lot about candidly. Just I spend too much time myself on social media, on Twitter, and just sort of the anonymity that exists in social media. And the distance sometimes when you're sort of hiding behind the computer screen, where it's a lot harder to be confrontational with somebody in person. It's easy to do it when you're on your mobile phone, for example. So just something to think about. But how do we kind of rebuild the public square? How do we rebuild civility? How do we turn the heat level down? How do we not kind of give more attention to the extremes and a little more to just kind of mainstream common good thinking? There's a lot of issues there to unpack, but the use of language is certainly at the heart of it.
Kevin, thank you. There is a lot there to process and unpack, and I really appreciate you coming and sharing your thoughts with us. It's interesting talking to somebody who's on the inside of that kind of political environment, but I appreciate the fact that you can kind of like step out and be reflective about it at the same time as you are a participant in it. I sometimes think that about myself. I'm a priest. These are many of the people who are in the community that I lead. I lead a community, and like sometimes I like have to step outside of my priest head and think people experiencing this. You said a number of things. I wrote some questions that I sent to you, but before I get to them, there are a couple of things you said that I just wanted to like pull out. And I think when you talked about social media, it reminded me of that idea from Marshall McLuhan, the Canadian communication specialist, that the medium is the message, and that there are certain kinds of medium that just shape the way communication functions. And because of the way that social media shrinks communication, makes it into like sound bites, and then becomes quite kind of easy to respond to aggressively because you don't have a personal connection with the person you're talking to, it seems to be characteristic of our age. And I think we haven't developed sufficient maturity with social media to know that it's doing that. Does that make sense? Oh, you're muted, Kevin.
it's still very fresh, Matthew. So we're still kind of learning how this is rewiring our brains and changing the way we communicate and changing the way we use words. And this is another minor example, but Susan Kennedy, my communications director, is on the call, and I'm always like, "Hey, Susan, shorten the descriptions in social media, like crunch them down, and then keep in mind people won't listen past like 5 seconds when we post a video." You hope that people will like listen to the whole thing, but you can't bury the lead. You actually have to put the relevant information right up front, because there's so much information coming at people. They won't even waste like a minute on what you're putting out there on a video. Like the dump out rate after like 5 seconds is really, really high. People get like, okay, what is he talking about? Got it. Okay, I'm moving on. So it's sort of forced people in my profession to really be thoughtful about how we sort of crunch things down, and how do you distill it into like a central idea that you can hit people with up front. But it's not conducive to the complexities of the world we live in, right? I mean, when you're developing public policy, I can't even begin to tell you how complicated some of these things are. Now, some of them are very simple, straightforward kinds of things. A lot of bills we deal with are really very straightforward. But when you're talking about a big time policy, how we do climate change resiliency across 58 counties, and the nuances among 58 counties, and the unique challenges that Los Angeles has versus Tulare County, and all these things, it does not lend itself to sound bites. It does not lend itself. So the communication is working on one track, but the policy development is on a completely different track in some ways. And how you kind of marry those two and educate the public about the kinds of things we're dealing with, that's it's not an easy task, especially with everything coming at people. And who has the time to sort of dig in when we barely have the time to dig into the depth we need to when you're making public policy?
Um, my mind's going in two different directions right now. One is I just got asked to be on the task force for the bishop for us to decide on the next steps of regathering. And there was a statistic there that was really interesting. I can't remember exactly. We're either 65 parishes across 22 counties, or we're 62 parishes across 25 counties. I've got to work that out. But one of the difficulties in like developing a diocesan policy for regathering is every county has a different set of criteria for health at the moment. And each of those parishes have different identities. Some are much older, some have lots of children, some have large numbers of guests visiting on a regular basis, some don't. And we were trying to work out how to speak to everybody. And there is kind of no speaking to everybody. But you also were reminding me of the important idea of stopping and reflecting before speaking. And I think social media actively discourages that. I think the idea of pausing before you repeat or say what you think is kind of going. And I'm trying to relearn it in this role in particular, because I just want to say to all the people from my congregation here, if I responded with the first response that I often thought of to all of you about stuff you were asking me, then we'd be falling apart like in a second. But I like my prayerful, reflective process. And I'm just really mindful that might not be quite so possible in social media or in politics at the moment. And so it all becomes entirely reactive.
Yeah. Well, the stop and breathe for a second is helpful. I'm the father of twin toddlers who have pushed me to the absolute limit on occasion, and I have to myself just kind of like stop, take a breath. But it is so hard, you sort of want to react in the moment, and social media lends itself to that. In fact, that's very perceptive, Matthew. I think people in my profession and pundits in particular, not even so much politicians. It's sort of like the pundit class, the commentariat, what have you. They will react to an article or post or something, and they'll come up with like sort of an extreme reaction. They want to get there first because they know then that will get retweeted, and that will be kind of the framing that I talked about. That will become kind of the frame in which a social media discussion happens. So the speed is actually, being rewarded,
Yeah.
but it's not always the right frame. It's not always certainly not always a constructive frame.
Yeah.
In fact, it's often the most negative stuff gets the most attention. So it's kind of like I really do think we are in the early stages of this revolution, right? And probably 10 years, 15 years, we'll look back and there will be kind of a whole different set of protocols, I think, because I think it will become apparent that a lot of this is very negative, and is not contributing to the common good. It's a divisive thing. I mean, I use these tools, but I guess you can hear underlying all of my words that I have a fairly dim view of social media as it's currently constructed, how these interactions are happening. But I'm also mindful, like if you look at the total number of users of, say, Twitter, it's actually relatively small in terms of the population as a whole. So it's sort of an outsized influence, maybe, because these are some megaphones that people are using. But there's a lot of conversations happening, in your setting, in other settings that are real, where a lot of genuine good work is happening that doesn't get attention in this media culture we have for ourselves.
Yes. Yes. Um, absolutely. I also really like the word that you use, tribal. Sorry, none of this is in any of the questions I sent you, but I'm just like what you said. You
Yeah.
talked about the idea of politics becoming tribal, and I'm really mindful of religion becoming tribal as well. And we all kind of gather around our symbols and signs. And from what you were saying, it became apparent to me that depending on which tribe you're in politically, you might vote against your own interests if your tribe is going in a different direction, or if it's been communicated to go in a different direction. In terms of religion, I'm really mindful of the fact that we actually have different visions of Jesus across different versions of Christianity, and that those different visions of who we follow mean that we sometimes are completely at cross purposes in our conversations. Who is Jesus that we follow? Is he kind of a radical Palestinian, brown-skinned leader who had this kind of preferential treatment for the poor, or is he kind of the I don't want to overly caricature this, but the kind of that white figure Jesus that sometimes has been created in Christian art through history, and it boggles my mind that like Jesus is a defender of Second Amendment rights, but that's getting a bit political, and I should like leave that out for the moment and just say but it boggles my mind that we got ourselves there. So I think that tribal nature is a shortcut because we can't understand all the issues. So we want to follow the people that we want to follow, who are our guides or our tribal leaders, as it were. And we're not necessarily engaging with the issues. And then it becomes really hard to change tribes, I think, or right. to decide differently. I actually think Joe Biden may have captured some of that as well, with a kind of a certain tribalism of his own. Although maybe that's too much to get into right now.
Yeah. So in preparation for the conversation, actually, I was digging in a little bit on. I went down kind of the rabbit hole of confirmation bias. Somehow I started like digging in on that, and I've always known confirmation bias is a thing, but it's sort of like, okay, picking that apart. But the tribalism aspect, there's a confirmation bias element there where you sort of you're rejecting information that doesn't conform to your preconceived ideas and notions, even if it's perfectly valid. It's it's been peer reviewed, it's been pressure tested. It's like these are some facts here. If it doesn't sort of reaffirm your preconceived ideas, you're inclined to reject it. And conversely, you accept ideas that sort of reaffirm your own biases. And social media, with kind of like the algorithms and the siloed nature, and I don't want to talk too much about social media, but it's such a dominant force in our in the world I live in day to day. But you sort of separate, and you're being fed information that your tribe is being fed. Like, you are sort of reverberating within your tribe, so to speak, your political tribe, and it sort of hardens your position. And
Mhm.
if you're being constantly fed information from that sort of those same few sources, and it just hardens your view that, yeah, this is the way it is, this is the reality. You have an alternate reality happening in a different tribe, and somehow, I don't have the answer to this. This is sort of like a holy grail kind of question, how you break those down and get people to, well, work off a common set of facts, because facts are facts,
Yeah.
right? Truth is truth, but also, beliefs are a different sort of outgrowth of that. And how do you listen to folks on the other side
Mhm.
and break down those silos, and somehow, with the media, sort of faith in the media being undermined, faith in institutions. I mean, you could speak to this, Matthew, just
Yeah.
sort of how faith, how religion, organized religion, is being viewed in America. Faith in institutions being eroded. But then you also have this need for identity
Mhm.
and sort of coming together as a team. Like, these are people that believe what I believe, and I feel comfortable with these people. Yet you can't get so comfortable in that tribe that you're not willing to listen to folks outside of it, outside of that silo. So the media information ecosystem needs to be we need to have a change there in terms of the how information is shared. And then there's got to be an effort to rebuild kind of that common good, political center, common square, whatever you want to call it, because
Mhm.
I think we're genuinely unhealthy place right now, politically and culturally, maybe, even with a lot of progress being made on a lot of fronts. I don't want to be too negative here, but I'm genuinely concerned, I guess, as somebody who's a practitioner of this, but also who's been on the planet for over 50 years now. It feels a little perilous, just in terms of the way kind of American democracy, sort of where we are at this point, and an uncertain future on in a lot of ways. So there's apprehension, I guess, and some
Yeah.
anxiety about what can we do together to solve these really big problems we have,
Yeah.
like race, income inequality, like climate change. I mean, I could go down the list of big problems that California is really at the center of.
Mhm.
So we're making progress, but not to the scale of the problems that we have, like the unhoused, the homelessness crisis we have. These kinds of things are, you're not going to get there with one party's prescription. It's got to be a common, purpose that we all come together around to solve these really big challenges we have.
Yeah. Thank you. I want to say one more thing about what you shared with me. That there is one question in my list that I wanted to ask, which I think you were beginning to answer there, which is, where does it remain constructive? Um, can you still find constructive
Hmm.
dialogue in politics today, or is it
Yeah.
totally gone?
No, well, I see it every day.
Right.
I see good stuff happen every day, between Democrats and Republicans in Sacramento, but it doesn't really get much attention,
It's
oddly.
not attention grabbing, is it?
It's not attention grab. I mean, I have some of the best relationships I have in Sacramento are with my Republican colleagues who are on the floor leadership team. This is getting really like inside baseball, but these are the people that we work with. to make sure that we're moving business, we're moving bills, and we pass Republican bills, we pass Democratic bills, and we are working across party. But it's also these aren't really hot button issues. It's more sort of day to day operational stuff. But I see it all the time that the parties can come together on things and decisions about how to proceed, but it just doesn't get a lot of attention. So I suspect, and I haven't ever worked in Washington D.C. I don't know how the Congress works. There's certain similarities there to how the state legislature works, but I'll bet there's a lot more bipartisan work that's happening that just doesn't get attention. But on the really big things, you see a lot of division, and that's where the media focuses. I mean, the media loves controversy, conflict, combat.
Yeah.
So I think that gets amplified, and you get kind of a distorted view of sort of how these things work.
Yeah, nobody's going to sit down and write a tweet that says, I just sat down and had a really constructive conversation with somebody on the other side of this issue from me. We had coffee and we made some compromise, and it was great.
Yeah, not a headline grabber.
Yeah. I'm going to segue to some things that people have asked in the chat. So Robert Bernadetti asks, how do we get science understood and communicated in policy discussions? That's not a small item, but I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Wow, that's a great question. And you see it in the climate change discussion in California. We have tried to, this is a little bit of a dodge on the question, but because you mentioned science, we're trying to build all of our climate investments around science, that the projects that get funded are based in good science, and that these aren't, say, political pork projects that get funded. We're going to fund resiliency projects based on their ability to sort of harden California for what is to come with regard to climate, and actually are science-based kinds of solutions. But I wish I knew the answer to that question. I mean, you're seeing this sort of play out with vaccine science, and COVID-19. We're right in the middle of this vaccine distribution challenge, and having people believe in science. I guess I'm hopeful that when we overcome the pandemic, and we are, that this was a victory for science. This was a victory for research and development, and this is going to be a massive victory for science, albeit it didn't happen fast enough, and there were missteps by government. The science here is leading the way, and it may sort of reframe the way people think about science. And these are research and development, biotechnology, life sciences companies coming up with these life-saving treatments and therapies and so forth. So I'm hopeful that science, certainly I could say folks in my party definitely are sort of preaching that in terms of belief in science, and it's mostly in regard to climate related issues, but we need to double down on the importance of science and facts guiding our decision making.
Thank you. Shreen Mars asked me in a direct message, reflecting on the heated nature of politics 100 to 150 years ago, and wondering, aside from Jules, I can imagine that there were also factions back then that operated from their own corners. And so I'm really mindful. I'm being called because I have to go to another service in a second, and I'll talk about that in a second. But I'm mindful that we think that politics is bad now, but it's been worse. People fought each other and shot each other and stuff in the past.
Yep.
Didn't they? That's the founding story of Hamilton, political opponents dueling against each other. So in some ways, it's bad, but maybe it's not as bad as it once was, or maybe you want to say something different about that.
Well, I would say it's an important reminder, and there's another bias, recency bias. Yeah, the times we're living in, you think are always the most consequential. Yes, we've absolutely as a country been through these kinds of divisions before and have overcome it. And I'm a big believer in the pendulum swings back and forth, that we're at this kind of really divisive point right now, but it doesn't mean it's always going to be this way, and it doesn't mean it's going to deteriorate even further. Like, we may get a better handle on sort of the impact of technologies, and other political movements will be given some momentum. Maybe we become a multi-party democracy as opposed to this two-party democracy. I mean, I think we may be going through a bit of a political transformation where the Republican Party looks a lot different 10 years from now. The Democratic Party may be different. In my lifetime, we haven't really seen a third party rise, but I do think we are going through a little bit of a political revolution that we're sort of at the beginning stages of, where the parties look different in 10 or 20 years, and the political discourse looks a lot different too. So things may look a lot different, but I'll remain optimistic that, hey, we've overcome these kinds of things in the past, and we will again in the future, and we will be resilient, and we will endure. It's going to be stops and starts, and trying to sort of figure out what that roadmap is to get to a better place.
There are more questions coming up that I think we have time to answer, but I'm also going to say, in terms of planning the forum, we've also got an extra service that's happening at 11:30, and I have to step out and put a robe on to go and be able to do that. I'm going to say Joe Michael, who is our Director of Operations, is going to maybe look at some of these questions with you. I hope that's okay, Kevin.
Yeah.
And also do a final farewell just before 11:30. And I want to say to people, we will be live streaming the service at 11:30 if you want to join in straight after this. But I want to say, Kevin, I'm grateful for your partnership in conversation in the past. And today we did a program in San Mateo where we talked about the housing crisis. And you came and spoke to that, and I had you up on stage engaging with an urban theologian, and you just like bounced around that conversation with kind of theological, philosophical ideas, as well as political and economic ideas, and your ability to do that is something that I always saw as a gift, and I'm grateful for that. There are some really intense questions here. But I'm going to, if you don't mind, step out and say Joe Michael is going to take on hosting duties, and say thank you for being here, and I will see you soon. And Susan, I'd love to grab coffee and talk about things at some point.
Wonderful to see you, sir. And good to see you doing great work up there, and really appreciate the audience and the partnership with you.
Thank you. So Joe Michael, over to you.
Thank you, Dean Matthew. Good morning again, everyone. There are a lot of really good questions in the chat here. So I'm going to try to move us through them so that people can still get to church at 11:30, however you are doing that. So let's see if we can go quickly through what we've got here. Robert asked a second question. Can discussions change minds, or do people need to have shared experiences to walk in other people's values?
Wow. I believe discussions can change minds. That being said, I privately made a comment this week that I'm not sure anybody's minds are being changed on the floor of the assembly when we have a debate. There's a lot of sort of, I think in a lot of ways people know how they're going to vote on certain things, but still want to come and make a political statement on the floor. That being said, we have some very genuine debates as well on the floor, and intense debates where everybody's actually listening, where they put the phone down and listen. But that's kind of the assembly. I think it's a broader question about, can people's minds change? I think absolutely thoughtful discussion. Frankly, thoughtful dialogue is the way forward. Not necessarily mediated by technology, but person-to-person communications are still the best. I know just as a politician, the gold standard is when you go to somebody's door and talk to them. If you're running for office, if you're basically making a connection to somebody in person and having a conversation, those are the richest kinds of exchanges, and it's often more effective than something online. So anyway, I hope that touched on the question a little bit, but that's a deep question, and I'm going to have to give it a little more thought.
It definitely did touch on the question, and it's actually a great segue to the next one from Lisa Harmon. Has social media reduced rather than enhanced opportunities for discussion?
Wow. I would say my opinion on that is a real mixed bag. The technology has given voice to communities that haven't had their voice properly heard before. Yet I'm not sure that the outcomes from discussions on social media are always productive, and you have to sift through kind of the negativity to get to the constructive. So I don't think it's limited. It's actually provided the opportunity, but it's really how we kind of harness and manage those conversations. And I mean, even as we speak, Facebook, if, for example, is under attack. Honestly, from every from all sides of the political spectrum, for some of the way they do their algorithms, but also banning former President Trump. Um, we are even now trying to figure our way, how do we sort of referee this? How do we manage this technology so it's not a negative influence? But that's another great question, and I don't have the answer. I just have an opinion, I guess.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm just going to keep on going because there's plenty more here. A question from Terry Gilmeet. As a politician, how do you debate with facts when people reject them and use their own version of them? It's so hard when you can't even find common ground to talk about policy. This is Terry speaking. I had someone tell me that science is not math.
Yeah, it's I, I I wish I knew how to properly counter if somebody's just rejecting factual information. I have to say, we've been fortunate in the assembly that those moments are actually relatively rare. And I'm able to present information. I present the studies. I present the data. I present sort of the underlying information to support the bill I'm moving or the position I take, and you hope that it's being received. But it does. I think that speaks to a larger question that's frankly probably above my pay grade in terms of what can we do to be working off a common set of facts. And I got to tell you, and I'm trying to resist going down any kind of a partisan road here, but there are media outlets that are fanning, putting out disinformation, things that it's just not accurate, and it's frustrating. It's frustrating, and I don't have a way to counter it other than you have to push back with the factual information and hope that folks in the middle who are persuadable um, are inclined to believe the facts, believe the data, believe the science, which is on your side, and you hope you win the debate and win the argument or win the policy outcome that way.
Thank you. I am going to go ahead and make a quick announcement that Kengo Akiyama will be our next forum speaker in July. We don't have an exact date set yet, so watch your e-news. And part of the reason I'm saying that is because Kengo asked some great and very deep questions that I'm thinking we probably won't get to. Let's see. We have a
It's
few
good
minutes
because
left.
the questions are probably too good for me to answer properly. So,
There-
but I may tune in for that next one.
there's some meaty stuff. So yeah, come on down to the next one. We'll let you know when we get it scheduled. But this will probably be the last one from Amanda Martin. Kevin, you stated infrastructure is still being used in government. Is there a new terminology used in government for infrastructure?
Man, we're trying to we're trying to figure that out even as we speak, because I use the word all the time. And there's no other way to do it at the moment than spelling out precisely what it means. What is an interesting discussion around human infrastructure that's gotten a lot of attention? Childcare, home health. The people that are serving and helping other human beings in our long-term care facilities. That's human infrastructure, for example. But we are trying to figure out some language around that can resonate. So that is a TBD. That is to be determined on some better language that we could use. And I welcome any ideas that anybody on the call has in that regard.
Thank you. Kengo, I hope you don't mind. I'm going to turn it over to you for the last minute here to ask whichever question you feel is most pressing. Go for it.
Oh, hi. Thank you, Kevin. No, I was just wondering, since you commented on the issues of social media and use of it, and there are some interesting studies, including the one that St. Matthew was talking about, how basically we have this idea that technology, we just have to use it right? So political discourse, we just have to be more thoughtful. We just have to be more careful with what we say, which obviously I think has enormous value. But what if the use of the technology itself is the demise of the kind of nuanced or thoughtful conversation? I mean, that's some of the kind of the deeper critique. And I just wondered, since you work in this, is there a way where we might resist or have, I guess, use the tool less? Because if the very use of the tool diminishes in one sense, and of course that sounds really unrealistic, right, from my standpoint. But I'm just wondering, as an assembly member, can you imagine at least, right? I'm not asking for procedural ways or anything, but a way forward where, because again, if the very thing is leaving us to the demise, as some people say, then the only solution might be to lessen the use, right, of technology itself. So I wonder if you could comment on that. Yeah,
it's a great point, because I mentioned that the pendulum swings back and forth. Folks may be gradually turning away from some of these things, or forcing changes in the technologies. But as long as there are so many eyeballs and so forth, there's so many users, it's hard to see these things going away, but they may evolve based on people's needs. I can tell you just my own personal habits. I generally, I will retweet articles. I don't do a lot of tweeting myself because I find sort of the negative interactions draining mentally, physically, emotionally. I don't like to kind of engage in a negative environment like that. So I think if people have a sense that this has a negative impact, you'll see use start to drop, or at least evolve, and the technologies will evolve. But would love to get some additional thoughts that you have on that, probably offline. But it sounds like you've done a lot of thinking about that and kind of where we all go from here in creating more positive interactions and better use of the technology. But the technology, the role of the technology itself absolutely has to be looked at, not just our own kind of behavior in using them. So I think that's kind of what you're getting at, and it's an evolving conversation, and would love to get your thoughts on that going forward.
Well, for that, I'm going to say, come on down to the next forum when we get it scheduled.
Please let me know when that is. Please let me know when that is.
And thank you so much, Speaker Pro Tem, for joining us. And thank you all for being here. And we're going to let everyone go to church. Thanks so much.
Right. Wonderful to be with y'all. Thank you.